Hello everyone, this is Julie Abels with Ridgelight Ranch and I am answering all of your questions today in a live Q&A. I've got a couple that people have sent here ahead of time on email, so I'm going to go ahead and get started on those. As you're watching this, please go ahead and feel free to enter in any more of your questions that you think of as I'm going along talking. So the first question that I have gotten probably more than anything else is about what sort of art supplies I suggest. So I am a classical conversations director, so I'm often buying supplies for groups of kids, usually about 8 kids in a classroom, and so that's usually what I'm thinking of, and that's most of my decisions have come out of that. This will be my 4th year directing, so I've had an opportunity to try out some different supplies and not be quite as tight on a budget as I was my first year directing. So keep that in mind as well. You may need to take some shortcuts if this is your first year directing and you don't have a lot of supplies built up. So first things first, paint. I know a lot of people really like these little kind of cake sort of paints for watercolor, but I find it's really hard to get intense colors and the kids get a little frustrated. And then often the younger kids, especially even the older kids too, will mix the colors together as they go, and then it's kind of hard to get them cleaned up. And so what I have gone to is using all tubes of paint. So these are just watercolor tubes, and they're really cheap. You can buy really high quality watercolor tubes and they're great paints, but you can also buy them really cheap. So this is the brand Artist Loft. I think it's the Michael's House brand actually, and I think the pack of these was like $5. I know I found this one on Amazon this year. The brand is Essentials, and it is 12 tubes of watercolor, and then it came with 2 paintbrushes as well, and it was around $5 on Amazon. So I think these work great. I've actually pulled these out and tested them a little bit and painted with them. They are not the same thing as a really expensive tube of watercolor paint, but they will absolutely do the job. When we don't have any skills, we often don't know the difference between really good quality and really cheaper paints. So I think it's great for this particular application for any kind of kids camp or kids painting. I think these are great. So then the next question is, what do I do with these paints? How do I give them to the kids? You could use a styrofoam plate. I have found a set of these. They're like $1 a piece at Walmart, and I really like them because I can just put a little dab of paint in each of these. Usually 2 students can share a palette. We can kind of divide it down the middle. They've got a center part that's used that you can mix some different colors, and enough little holes that you can put, a little bit of paint in each one. I will say last year I bought a set of, I think it was 8 or 10 of these, and we used them throughout the entire year. I've noticed that some of them have gotten pretty used up. I think some of them have even gone in the trash already because they're used up. But I think that that one of these is probably good for the whole year. For my community at least. We have 3 classrooms, 8 students each, so 24 students. We usually do about half of our visual art lessons with paint, and so you're talking about 6 painting lessons. That gives you kind of a rule of thumb to follow. Next, I want to talk about paintbrushes. I am okay with cheaper paintbrushes. I have some very expensive paintbrushes that were handed down to me by some family members. My husband's grandmother was a painter, and so when she went into an assisted living facility, I got a lot of her art supplies, and I've got some really awesome paintbrushes. But that being said, I've also got a lot of cheap brushes, and for the most part, the kind of art we're doing, it doesn't make that much difference. Now, if you get super cheap brushes, it is frustrating. So let me show you what a super cheap art brush looks like. First, these here, this is often what comes in your little Crayola cake watercolor set. And what I don't like about them is that even when the brush is brand new, this one here is brand new, it kind of flares out and you've already got pieces coming out. The other thing is they tend to be really wimpy. Sometimes when you see them, they're already kind of folded over like a sad plant. And so for me, those are really frustrating. So what I have gone to instead, I have just a big group of watercolor brushes or brushes we use for anything. I try to make sure that each student has some kind of paintbrush that's got a little bit of a flat edge. You can kind of see the way that that's wider on one side, and then something that's a little bit, I don't know if you can see that's more of a round brush. You can get into, you can teach all the different types of brushes. There's some great vocabulary that goes along with this. And then I like to have some bigger brushes. And so for my bigger brushes, I often try to get something, maybe about this size. And a lot of the times what we're doing, just a nice, softer, but still, you can see that it stands up. They're not falling over like a sad plant. They're standing up. This one's a little squared on the top. This one's a little more round. This is, for the most part, this is what we use. Oh, I see Deanna has a question. You can let the color dry out in that palette and re-wet it. Yes, you can. This is one of the fun things about watercolor. The pigment that you find in a cake, you can find some really nice quality pigment watercolors. The fact that this isn't a cake does not necessarily mean it's low quality. The quality of the watercolor has a lot to do with the ingredients in it, not whether it's cake or in tube form. So if you put some watercolor paint in these and then it dries out in between, you just add a little bit of water and it's re-wet and you can use it again. Now, in my experience working with the students, if the younger class, for example, last year we had a class of all 4-year-olds. Once the 4-year-olds were done with this palette, there was no saving any of it. It was all just mixed into a muddy mess, and that's okay. They're having fun. This is fine. The way that we rotated art supplies last year, the second class to get all the art supplies was the oldest group, and these were 9 to 14-year-olds. They just instinctively were a little bit more careful about how they mix those paints together, and we could take the whole palette, semi-wet, semi-dry, and take it to the next classroom and let those kind of 5 to 8-year-olds use the same palette, and we didn't even use more paint. So great question, Deanna. All right, so now we've covered brushes and paints and palettes. The next thing I wanted to cover is colored pencils. So here's the thing about colored pencils, that you can do a lot of research on it. There's some are wax based, and there's different ways of using them. Personally, when I'm doing art, I really love the Prismacolor pencils. You can get Prismacolor pencils in a wide variety of qualities. So there's actually a line of these that's called the Scholar Prismacolor pencils, and they're really great. And the neat thing about even the Scholars, you can blend them like a proper colored pencil would blend. So that's my preference as far as like real art pencils. I don't buy these for my community because most of the time the kids don't have a lot of practice, and they get really frustrated with a pencil that they can't erase. And so what I have done is just use the Crayola erasable colored pencils. And my erasable colored pencils, oh, I think my children have snagged them. Hold on just 1 minute. All right. My kids love to use these because they're erasable. It makes them really just a lot more convenient for them. Most of the time we're working on some basic drawing skills and not necessarily the skill of learning to blend with a colored pencil. So I use these, I don't know if that's backwards in your screen or if you can read it, but it's the Crayola brand of erasable colored pencils. They are not like a proper colored pencil. You cannot blend with these. You know, if you can color one color over the other and get some of that blending look, but you can't use a colorless blender or a white or use any of those burnishing techniques that you would use on with a traditional colored pencil. They just don't work with these. That's not the kind of pigment that's in them. But if you are focusing, if your lesson is really focusing on some component of drawing, then these are a great way for the kids to be able to quickly and easily color, and then they still erase really well. So that's a good benefit. All right, next, some of my art lessons have markers this year. And so I often get questions, what kind of markers do you suggest? And let's see, let me pull my markers out. My favorite is, quite honestly, the Crayola Ultra Washable. These are great because the parents do not have to worry too much about the staining or the clothes, because they really do come out of clothes pretty easily. But you can also, because they're a really nice fine tip, you can get in there and color really nicely. The colors tend to be consistent from one pack to another. So if you buy, 4 boxes and they're all the same colors, you can generally exchange from one to the next. And sometimes that's a little easier than having a box of markers that's 50 different colors, and then as soon as you set one color down, you're trying to find that exact blue. I can't find the same blue. Look, I started coloring here with one color blue and now it's different, and it's upsetting. So for the students, and especially the younger ones, I really like these Crayola Ultra Washables. I tend to get the fine tip. I was at first a little worried that the younger children might damage the tip, but these have been used for a year and the tips are in pretty good shape, so I think they held up really well. So those are my suggestions as far as basic art supplies are concerned. I'd love to see if you have any other questions, let me know, and email me some of your questions and I'll answer them. The next basic question that I get asked a lot is, how in the world are you taking these art projects and managing to make them work for 4-year-olds on one end and 12-year-olds on the other? And there are a lot of really great ways that we can modify art projects. And so I kind of wanted to talk you through some of those and just think about what it is that your goal is. I think anytime that we've got an art lesson, and I want to start and just say all of my art lesson plans include suggestions for how to modify this for older and younger children. So I have gone through the trouble of thinking through the goal of the art lesson plan and still making it work for the younger and older kids. But just so you know, and just to kind of give you a heads up and just a little background and kind of behind the scenes as to what I'm doing and how I make this work, I wanted to give you an idea of how I'm making all of these art lessons work for all the different age groups. So the first thing, and I talk about this a lot, is tracing. And tracing is neat because it works for a wide variety of circumstances and it works for a wide variety of children. I have 3 different blog posts on my website about tracing, and there's just a lot that can be gained by tracing. And it's one of these weird things in the art world that people feel strangely about. They feel like it's cheating. But I'm here to say it's not cheating. It's really okay to trace, and you can develop some really good skills tracing. So I would just like to really encourage you to try it out. Now, the key to tracing and making it worthwhile is to really be thinking about what you're doing while you're tracing. So always try to have in mind, where is this line going, up or down, in or out, left or right, and that really helps you to be mindful tracing. So when you're thinking about what other scaling, you think about like, okay, we're going to scale the art project. What are some of the other ways that we can scale? I kind of tend to break these into 2 groups. And so not only am I looking at the art lesson and what the objective is, but I'm also looking at the students and why they need it scaled. So some students will need this, scaled down because of, let me back up a minute. Skill level, we're scaling because of skill level, but skill level is about ability, not age. And so I always want to throw that in there. Remind yourself it's not about age. I have some 4-year-olds that are incredible and are more skilled artists than the 12-year-olds. So keep that in mind when you're teaching and try and provide for the wide variety of skill level and ability that's there. Okay, so ability is all from passion and practice. And so some of the students are going to lack passion. They're going to lack the interest level. They don't want to do art. This isn't what they're interested in. And so for those students, I'm usually finding a scaling method that's going to make it a little quicker or easier. Tracing is great. Look at those tracing resources. Think about changing to a coloring activity. Sometimes the kids are, they're not at all about, they just don't have the interest. They don't want to put the work into drawing something. But you can give them something that's already been drawn, say a line drawing of a famous work of art, and then they can color that in, and that gives them a lot of fine motor skill practice. It exposes them to fine works of art. They can look at color and how the color makes an impact. So there's a lot of good skills to be learned from that. The next one is to just simplify. Sometimes if we reduce the detail of what we're doing, the project can go a little quicker and be more fun for students that are not as interested. So, think about, for example, in my art lesson about Grant Wood's American Gothic. I have two different line drawings. One has a little more detail and one has a lot less detail. And so if the kids just lack interest and passion, giving them something a little simpler to work on is a lot less intimidating. So again, passion and practice. Some kids lack that passion and interest. Some kids just lack the practice or the experience that needs to go into any new skill. So again, we can use tracing for this. We can simplify by reducing details. We can also do things like reducing the paper size. A lot of times, if you start out with a big, piece of art paper and you're trying to fill the whole thing in, there's a lot that can go into that. But if you come down, to a smaller piece of paper, suddenly it's a lot less daunting and you can really throw your heart into something small. For that reason, my community really likes the half-size sheet of paper, so it's about a 5.5 by 8.5 sheet. And that really helps our students, especially since we're short on time. We work in 30-minute time blocks, and it's really short. The next thing we can do is partially complete a project ahead of time and give students a head start. So, for example, in my Andrew Wyeth lesson plan, I have a sketch that looks like Christina's World, but it's that line drawing, it's a sketch. We can actually print that onto a piece of watercolor paper, and then the students can just focus on painting using different colors and tones like Andrew Wyeth would, and not have to work on sketching and painting at the same time. They're two different skills, and sometimes we want to just focus on one at a time, especially when our time is short. Another example would be to maybe have them, in the Georgia O'Keeffe, one of the scaling options is to give them a pre-drawn picture of abstract rose, white rose that O'Keeffe does. So for the more experienced, the higher skill level students, they could sketch their own lines in. The kids that lack some of that experience, you could just give them that pre-sketched, and then they could focus on, how to move in tones from dark and light. The last example I have is just reducing the scope of the project. So for example, last year when we were studying Linnaeus, instead of trying to do an entire botanicals are beautiful, but they take so much time and so much work. Instead of trying to do this whole botanical, we reduced it down to just one pine leaf stem and cone. And for the younger ones, I encourage them to just focus on the pine branch or the cone. So we're reducing the scope of the project. So as you're going through, all of my lesson plans already include suggestions for scaling art for different skill levels. If you feel like it's just not scaled enough, you can always add one of these in. You can always combine these different methods. So those are some of my different scaling options. Those are the two main questions that I get. I am happy to answer more. As you guys are watching this on the replay, thank you so much for coming back and watching on the replay. Feel free to go ahead and add some of your questions to the comments, and I will answer them next time. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.